Well, welcome everyone. I'm thrilled to see you and your avatars in the Zoom gallery popping in from all over the place. I'm Jessica Pressman. I'm a professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at San Diego State. I also am co-founder and co-director with Dr. Pam Lack of the Digital Humanities Initiative here at San Diego State. And we are thrilled to welcome you to our first virtual book talk lecture of the fall semester. We are going to have, I'm going to do a short introduction of our speaker, followed by about 30 minutes of talk, and then we'll open it up for conversation for half-hour Q&A. We'll go for just 1 hour, and I'll be attentive to time. And please feel free to use the chat. You can type questions or comments into the chat, and I will hopefully find them during Q&A. All right, well, first of all, thank you all for being here. We know how tight time is these days, but here at the Digital Humanities Initiative at San Diego State is really established to help stimulate the research and ideas and passions of our faculty. And we are really about a focus on the human and the humanities and the digital humanities in particular. So I'm thrilled with that to be able to introduce you to Roopika Risam today, who is the chair of secondary and higher education and an associate professor of education and English at Salem State University. She also serves as the faculty fellow for the Digital Library Initiative's coordinator of the Graduate Certificate in Digital Studies, and the coordinator of combined BA MED in English education. And she's important for us as a digital humanities initiative. Our primary focus is global diversity. And her research interests lie at the intersections of post-colonial and African diaspora studies, humanities knowledge infrastructures, and digital humanities. And we've been wanting to host Roopika for a while now. And we are fans of her as a person and her work. We're readers of her scholarly publications and interactors and teachers of her DH projects. And I personally have been including the work Torn Apart Separados in my syllabi as an example of the best kind of DH work for a while now. If you don't know it, it's a digital visualization project that responds to the Trump administration's family separation policy. And it shows the power of DH to work in real life for real lives. It's amazing. And that's really the kind of work that Roopika does. We were supposed to have her speak last spring, but at that point in the semester, we were all frankly overworked and exhausted after a year of pandemic work. So following the mission of our initiative here at State, which is to center the human in the digital humanities, we pushed off her talk to fall, and we're grateful to her for her flexibility in scheduling. But in the meantime, while pushing off her talk to the fall, Roopika published another co-edited collection, a really good one called The Digital Black Atlantic. And she also received a huge and hugely important grant to do social justice DH work, a $3 million Mellon grant that hopefully she's going to talk a little about. Congratulations, again, amazing. But before turning it over to her, and I apologize for the lengthy introduction, I actually want to read a few quotes from her really brilliant book. Here it is, so you can see it. New Digital Worlds, Post-Colonial Digital Humanities in Theory, Praxis, and Pedagogy. And this is a brilliant book, I will say, because it's brilliant in its lucid historical narrative of digital humanities, and also in its depiction of the shortfalls and opportunities for the future of digital humanities. So for those of you that are new to the field, I would start here. She writes, quote, "Digital humanities pedagogy is not an attempt to teach students particular technical skills, applications, or platforms, but a pedagogical approach that enables them to envision a relationship between themselves and knowledge production," end quote. She also writes, quote, "Post-colonial digital pedagogy further introduces students to the stakes of cultural power in knowledge production," end quote. I chose those quotes, and I hope that my fellow SDSU colleagues and students hear in them echoes of our rationale and mission here for digital humanities at SDSU, because we built our DH program as an area of excellence focused on global diversity. And we look to empowering our students, not with specific skills or or tools, but actually to become better digital citizens, better critical thinkers. So we look to Roopika's research, teaching, and networking to help us navigate our ever-changing digital culture and record. So I'm honored to welcome her to this Zoom, and I ask all of you from all over the place to join me in welcoming Roopika Risam. I'll mute myself and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for your generous introduction, and to you and to Pam for organizing this, and all of you for being here today, regardless of what time zone you are in. I know we're all over the place. It's 3:08 here in Eastern time. Today, I am going to speak to some of the questions that have been on my mind in the context of my latest books. So Jessica mentioned my monograph, New Digital Worlds. I've also recently with Rahul Kegairola published South Asian Digital Humanities, which is a collection that was based on a South Asian Review special issue that we had previously edited. And also the Digital Black Atlantic, which I co-edited with Kelly Baker Josephs for the Debates in the Digital Humanities series at the University of Minnesota Press. So first, to better understand the work that I do, it's important to know that I am primarily concerned with evaluating and understanding digital humanities methodologies. So how we undertake this research, and more specifically, how to do so in ways that don't reinforce colonial thought and don't amplify dominant cultural thinkers and texts, but rather to create the space for voices that have for too long gone unheard as we produce digital humanities scholarship. And actually, I joke that the ultimate goal of my research is to be irrelevant, that what I have to say should hopefully be so obvious and so fundamental to our practices that I am totally unnecessary. And I'm hopefully we're getting there slowly. Since it's been a few years since New Digital Worlds came out, I want to tell you a little bit about it and to highlight some of the main points that I think can get overlooked by readers, because they're absolutely essential to highlight to realizing the promise of digital humanities scholarship, particularly for texts and histories and cultural heritage of communities that have been marginalized by colonialism, racism, and increasingly by globalization. So I'm just going to check the chat, make sure you're not trying to tell me something. Oh, good. Nobody's trying to tell me anything. That's my live in fear of the chat saying, we can't hear you and your internet's going out.
No, I got it. Don't worry.
Thank you. So New Digital Worlds came out in 2018, in November 2018, from Northwestern University Press. It was really the culmination of years of thinking alongside friends and interlocutors about the ways that digital humanities reproduces the hallmarks of colonialism in the digital cultural record. And what I was trying to do is really offer an opening salvo for a conversation about how our digital humanities practices need to change if we are to more fully realize the promises of and attend to the challenges of open access to knowledge. So what New Digital Worlds tries to do is to offer a broad look at the full supply chain of digital knowledge production, from methods to tools, from archives to professional organizations, and from research to teaching. And my primary goal was to call for an urgent rethinking of digital humanities methodologies to ensure that our work is not unthinkingly reproducing and amplifying the gaps and omissions of the cultural record, which is deeply inflected by colonialism, as we are trying to construct a digital one. And I wasn't intending the book to be prescriptive. It was really just the beginning of a conversation and a space clearing gesture and a provocation to build on and to quibble with. And this is the same approach that Kelly Baker Josephs and I were taking when we were working on the Digital Black Atlantic, which is our volume exploring African diaspora digital humanities. And as we wrote in the introduction to the volume, the process of editing this book was simultaneously the process of claiming space for a digital Black Atlantic. While we needed to honor the work that has already been done in this arena, we chose not to define or be prescriptive about borders. Rather, our objective was to create a provisional space and a framework for academic conversation that could emerge by virtue of acts of citational and conceptual juxtaposition. In the several years since the publication of New Digital Worlds, it has enjoyed a warm welcome from many corners of digital humanities. My intention when writing the book was to address digital humanities practitioners of the global north. And I wanted to urge those of us who work in these spaces to examine how the research, the technical, and the design choices that we make can reinstantiate the canons of literature, history, and culture. And many of us have been engaging in these conversations for a number of years now, whether through Twitter hashtags like DHPOCO or TransformDH, as well as through organizations like Global Outlook Digital Humanities, which I was a founding member of. But even digital humanists are more likely to believe something when it comes in monograph form. And so that was why I ended up writing the book. And New Digital Worlds found that audience in the global north. I was very happy about that. So I was very much writing in that tradition to that audience, concerned that those of us who practice digital humanities in the Academy of the Global North might be doing harm, however unintentionally. And I hoped that we might collectively consider alternate ways of thinking and making with digital humanities and to recognize our role in decentering digital humanities practices of the global north. So I was urging us to really rethink forms of building and collaboration and organization and teaching that could resist the reification of colonial histories and practices represented in our projects. To think not only about our content, but also how we develop our research projects. And the adoption of New Digital Worlds in courses in the global north and its citations really do suggest that it has reached that intended audience. But what I was really surprised by was that New Digital Worlds and the concepts behind postcolonial digital humanities found another audience among scholars of the global south. And the feedback that I've received from them is, I think, largely unwarranted. I've been told that they can do their work because of my book when they have already been doing important work, in some cases for decades, long before my book. They've thanked me for inspiring them when their work is actually what is really inspirational. And they've said that I've given them a voice when they already had one. And these were kind responses, but they brought me a lot of discomfort because they were not my intended audience, because they're the experts of digital humanities in the global south, not me. And I certainly wasn't speaking to them, but that happens when you write a book. But I definitely wasn't speaking for them. And I recognize that there's a symbolic value to my identity as a Kashmiri woman and an immigrant to the US that's playing a role in this enthusiastic reception. But what I found was that these responses from my colleagues in the global south were rehearsing a troubling trend in digital humanities scholarship that ironically I had written and warned about in the book, which is the way that well-circulated writing from the global north becomes the frequently taught and frequently cited scholarship in the global south. And the danger of this phenomenon is that it overshadows local expertise and it threatens to forestall the growth of local humanities practices and instead replaces them with a fictive global that's not actually universal. It's actually a particular practice of the global north that's sort of putting itself forth as a universal. So I found that this has been an unintended consequence of the book. And there are three primary areas where I've seen this happening. That's what I want to talk about today. The first is the overdetermination of post-colonial thought by the US and European academies. The second is the way that the usage of post-colonial has been taken to be discursive and not about material reality. And then finally, the third is the centering of the post-colonial elite in digital humanities discourses. And these are critiques that could be made of post-colonial studies more generally. They have been made of post-colonial studies, yet they're issues of critical importance to consider in the broader context of post-colonial digital humanities, to ensure that it doesn't just become another hegemonic discourse that loses sight of the most vulnerable communities. So in the context of the global academy, post-colonial studies has been an inextricable part of the emergence of the academic star system, since the 1980s. And it's overly emphasized the work of post-colonialists working in the global north, often as emigres. And as a result, the geospatial terrain of post-colonial studies scholarship skews heavily towards scholars in the US and Europe, and they are the ones who are most widely read and most widely cited. Now, this phenomenon is born from the uneven distribution of institutional resources in the broader context of global capitalism, and that's shaped the landscape of higher education and of knowledge production more generally. But despite the financial challenges faced by many higher education institutions in the global north, the relative wealth of US institutions, and this is similar for Europe as well, have allowed them to attract and retain post-colonial scholars, positioning not countries in the global south, but instead the US and Europe as the putative centers of post-colonial knowledge production. In the context of digital humanities, my thinking on these issues has been deeply influenced by conversations with James Smithies and Paul Barrett, who have raised crucial questions about how post-colonial digital humanities risks reproducing these dynamics. In 2013, when first engaging with the concept, James Smithies wrote in horror, "My first reaction to seeing what D.H. POCO, that's Postcolonial Digital Humanities, stood for was, understandably, according to colleagues I've spoken to recoil in confusion. It didn't represent anything I understood postcolonialism to be, or speak to the postcolonial worlds I know. Critical theory, yes, a powerful melange of identity theory and feminisms, queer theories and activist politics, but not my postcolonialism. Frankly, my first thought was the US is colonizing postcolonialism. All I'm seeing is a provincial, I don't mean that in a pejorative way, US instantiation of the term that requires localization for New Zealand and probably Australia and the rest of the world." So that was a little ouchy, but we're still friends. Actually, this is why we're friends. And because Smithies identified the crucial pitfalls of undertaking post-colonial studies, namely its overdetermination by scholars within the US and its need for provincialization. Post-colonial digital humanities, as articulated through a US frame, which is what I was doing, cannot be neatly overlaid onto digital humanities practices in any cultural context. Rather, it requires localization to the histories and presence of colonialism in the context in which it's invoked. So in the US, for example, we often contend with the tensions between how post-colonialism as an instance of critical theory offers crucial insight on questions of representation, materialism, and globalization, but it does so often without recognizing that the US itself is a settler colony. Even when post-colonial theory looks at US imperialism, they tend to look abroad at US imperialism around the world and not looking inward at how the very universities that we work in that produce the conditions in which we theorize have benefited from indigenous dispossession and genocide. So Smithy's observations were really crucial to my thinking and to what would become a central tenet of New Digital World, which is the need for attention to local and not global digital humanities practices. Several years later, in 2015, Paul Barrett asked a really important question. Where is the nation in post-colonial digital humanities? And of course, like when somebody asks you this question in 2015, in 2019, they're going to come ask you to write a chapter on it for a volume they're editing. So that happened. But Barrett noted that one element of the post-colonial that seems absent from a post-colonial digital humanities approach is the continued salience of the nation as an organizing structure and category of analysis. And Barrett offered a series of probing questions for digital humanities practitioners to consider. And there are a lot of them, but just going to give you a couple of them here. How is the nation present in however ghostly or marginal a form within our digital humanities work? Is digital humanities a form of US hegemony masquerading as transnationalism? These questions were as salient to my thinking as Smithy's critique. Therefore, in the book, in addition to the importance of local digital humanities, I explicitly addressed the phenomenon where prominent voices of the digital humanities in the US, so frequently cited scholars like Matthew Kirschenbaum, Steve Ramsey, and Franco Moretti, are the very ones whose work is taught on syllabi and cited in scholarship in the Global South. And these patterns of teaching and citation promote US hegemony and occlude the local and regional practices that are essential to undertaking digital humanities scholarship. When we were writing the Digital Black Atlantic, Dr. Josephs and I wrestled with these very questions of citation. As we noted, what we have found in preparing this volume is both confirmation of and challenge to our initial framing. For example, the citations within the project indicate that we do not have a common body of scholarship for Black-centered digital studies that we can turn to in building this field. The interdisciplinary and transnational nature of this work means that our writers draw on vast and varied scholarly communities and voices. We went on, this is not necessarily a bad thing. The conversations are greatly enriched by many interlocutors from different disciplines and different countries, and thus we are in little danger of becoming an echo chamber. In scholarship, particularly on marginalized communities, the practices of citation are key to building and reinforcing a recognized and recognizable canon that confers status on an area of study. In the context of South Asian studies, and Rahul Kegairola and I note this in the South Asian Digital Humanities volume, digital humanities practices have emerged over several decades with particular strengths in literary studies and cultural heritage. And what's clear is that the digital humanities scholarship there is not at all derivative of scholarship produced in the global north. It is developed in response to particular linguistic and cultural needs and to institutional contexts and labor contexts. Yet the teaching and citation practices continually refer back to and frame this really important creative and innovative work, not through the leaders of that scholarship, but instead to scholarship of the global north, including my own. This is not to suggest that I am promoting a new nationalism of digital humanities scholarship, and in fact, there is a value to transnationalism, but it's really crucial that scholarship of the global north doesn't become the way of validating scholarship in the global south, but rather to attend to the communities of practice that have developed in a particular region. Because choosing who we cite, choosing who we teach is a way of signaling value. So it's especially critical to recognize and value the work that's being done within regional contexts. And I'll just say, in the context of South Asia, there is absolutely no dearth of scholars who produce brilliant scholarship. People like Sukanta Chaudhary, P.P. Sneha, Padmini Ray Murray, Maya Dodd, and Nidhi Kalra, who have produced the insights that localize the broad strokes of post-colonial digital humanities. And so we really need to be attending to those citational practices and ensuring that that work gets its due. Another area of deep concern is the focus on the discursive. And again, we get this in a strange way from post-colonial studies, but it can very much manifest in post-colonial digital humanities. When I brought my training in post-colonial studies to bear to digital humanities, it was not without my own apprehensions of post-colonial theory and its limits. In fact, my engagement with post-colonialism has really always been one that's been very ambivalent, which is very suitable. If you're familiar with post-colonial theory, they're always talking about ambivalence. On the one hand, New Digital World certainly owes much to the language that post-colonial studies has offered us for talking about colonialism and its legacies. But on the other hand, I am deeply concerned about its tendency to privilege discourse over material circumstances. So there are, of course, post-colonial theorists like Ijaz Ahmad and Benita Perry, whose work is grounded in materialism. And even those who really sort of are focusing on theorizations of colonial discourse do base their theorization on material histories of colonialism. But the emphasis on the discursive risks superficial embrace of shallow notions of decolonization that end up overlooking the nuances of colonialism. And we see this, for example, in the US context, where you might, like me, have heard a lot about decolonizing the curriculum and decolonizing the university. And in my own institutional experiences, I've been a little bit dismayed to see our diversity initiatives rebranded as decolonization, when what they're talking about is simply adding readings by people of color and Indigenous people to syllabi, which is, of course, what we should be doing, but it's also not decolonizing anything. This emphasis on the discursive elements of colonization has wrought a popularization of discourses of decolonization that really end up eliding the responsibilities that those of us who reside within settler colonies like the US have to Indigenous people. And in the context of social justice and anti-racist education, Eve Tuck and Kei-Wayne Yang have written a wonderful article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor that speaks to this and pushes back against the ways that decolonization has been co-opted in the US and Canada. In this case of this sort of decolonizing the curriculum here in the US, scholars have really latched onto curricular initiatives in the UK that deploy that language. The UK has a substantially different relationship to empire and to indigeneity. And even there are debates about whether the decolonization of curriculum is actually a thing. But its adoption in the US does significant harm because it then seems to absolve those of us who are settlers of the need to examine and address how universities have, in fact, benefited from Indigenous dispossession and genocide and continue to do so. So while post-colonial studies as a body of thought has offered many wonderful insights on how we can understand language and culture. What it also has inadvertently done is lead many to believe that representation, and more specifically representation in the eyes of the global north, is enough. So indeed, the greatest trick that postcolonial studies ever played was convincing academics that decolonizing discourse was enough. And it's really crucial that we cannot let this be a limit of postcolonial digital humanities too, that our scholarship is more than just about a matter of representation, a matter of what we include, but also a matter of the entire apparatus and life cycle of a project, the decisions that we make, the collaboration, the forms of collaboration that we adopt, the ways we collaborate with communities and reshape that sort of traditional power dynamic where the university is the holder of all knowledge and the community isn't. So these are sort of angles that we need to be actively thinking about if we are to meet the sort of mandate of postcolonial digital humanities. So wherever we are and whatever our relationship is to colonialism, I'm increasingly convinced that digital humanities practitioners have a responsibility to ensure that the complexities of culture and history that have been elided by colonialism, so for example, nationality, caste, and indigeneity, are rendered legible. And in the South Asian context, for example, until the emergence of subaltern studies in the 1980s, Indian history tended to primarily focus on the role of nationalist elite in independence movements. Scholars of subaltern studies like Gyan Pandey, Ranajit Guha, and depending on who you ask, Gayatri Spivak, have really emphasized the importance of rethinking an approach that shifts away from those sort of dominant figures towards more overlooked actors like rural peasants and people who are lower caste. And so this advocacy for a shift away from dominant upper caste narratives to the subaltern is really instructive for postcolonial digital humanities. When we consider gaps in scholarship, particularly in relation to countries in the global south, and there I'll use South Asia as an example, it's important that we don't address gaps by simply reflecting dominant voices and perspectives. So that's to say, when we talk about South Asia, we're not just talking about India. And when we're talking about India, we're not just talking about upper caste Indian people, but are also thinking about the inclusion of scholars and voices who are Dalits. You may be more familiar with the term untouchable, but that is an archaic term, and Dalit is the term now, as well as Vimukta Jati, who are India's indigenous people who are called denotified tribes by the Indian government, and other minoritized people within these countries, and ensuring that they become part of the cultural record in their own voices and on their own terms. And we can translate this concept in other cultural contexts by assessing whether digital humanities scholarship is focused on the most relatively privileged or dominant cultural group or not. The first way to begin thinking about this is really to begin with examining digital humanities practices as they've arisen in a particular context, and to foreground questions of epistemological power and epistemic violence. So when we're working with materials or we're undertaking a project, really the very first question must be, which epistemologies are being sanctioned and privileged and valorized, and whose voices are being authorized by a project, and whose are potentially being disenfranchised, and how do we then address that? In the context of working with digital archives, the crucial questions are, how is the archive constructed? What does it contain? What is and what isn't there, and why not? And in this context, to what extent does this work reinforce the oppression of the most marginalized groups of people? The question then becomes, what do we as practitioners have to do to avoid reproducing and amplifying these forms of archival violence? So is it feasible to offer a corrective? Are there perspectives that are unrecoverable? Because we know that archival erasures exist and can be permanent. And in that case, then what do we do to address the existence of that absence? So that is to say that the very questions that we need to be asking of our digital humanities practices in the US to ensure that we're not perpetuating white dominant culture are essentially the same ones that we need to be continually reframing in any cultural context, with attention to the most vulnerable and marginalized people in that cultural context. And this was something that Dr. Josephson actually took great care with in the editing of the Digital Black Atlantic, in which talking about digital humanities scholarship in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Dominica, and the US are substantially different and require attention to the sort of local context in which the scholarship is being developed. So what I'm arguing here for is the very change in method that I was advocating for in New Digital Worlds. When we translate the insights of postcolonial digital humanities to a new context, we need to ensure we aren't unintentionally reproducing a pattern of violence and disenfranchisement for marginalized communities in that location. And if we're going to fully realize the possibilities of postcolonial digital humanities, then our methods need to change. And who gets to determine the methods needs to change. So this means rethinking how we collaborate with people. Who are we accountable to? In the context of India, for example, how to give voice to people who are Dalits or who are Vimukti Jati, not by representing them or speaking for them, but thinking about how to provide them with the means, the financial support and access to the means of production of knowledge for self-representation on their own terms if they want it. Rather than a model that is so present in our scholarship, which is extracting knowledge and expertise from the most marginalized people for the privileged researchers' benefits. So I'm happy to speak more in the Q&A about any angle of what I raised, but I just want to wrap up by saying that I do believe in the ideas that I advanced in New Digital Worlds and that were later elaborated on in South Asian Digital Humanities and in the Digital Black Atlantic. But it's really critical that these ideas don't simply become ways that more relatively privileged communities end up marginalizing an entirely new group of people and perpetuating the very dynamic of subalternity in the digital cultural record that I was warning about in the book. And doing so really requires localization of digital humanities and taking seriously the national context in which we work. And that's the only way that the fuller possibilities of postcolonial digital humanities can be realized. Thank you so much for your attention.
I'll clap since everyone else is muted, or you can unmute and clap. Thank you so much. That was just like a whirlwind of brilliance and also a modeling, I think, a kind of modeling of what you were arguing for in terms of your citational style and amplification of voices and a focus on process. I would like to invite everyone to type into the, oh, Sarah's already got one, to type into the chat any questions that you have. And I would actually like to begin and also offer you, Roopika, if you would like to talk about the grant too, because one of the things that I think is really important, I'll tease out, you said representation is not enough, decolonizing, the language and discourse of decolonizing is not enough. And you're focused on localization, right? As a response to the global and the universal concept of digital humanities or humanities more generally. And what I love about your work and even your talk today is that you really model how method is argument, how your work enacts local collaboration and praxis as scholarship and as product, even kind of you pointing out that a monograph is in some ways against that kind of local collaborative work, which is really radical, right? And undercuts all that we've been brought up to think of within the university, as that the monograph and the single individual is the source of knowledge located in the global north, as you said, and in English, et cetera. So I would love to just hear you, as people are writing into the chat their questions. Do you see digital humanities practices, which as we at least understand to be about collaboration and process rather than end product and individual, and certainly, at least in our understanding, much more embodied in material rather than discursive. Do you see that becoming, providing models for the humanities more broadly? Do you see at a certain point, you mentioned at the beginning that you hoped your work would become irrelevant? Do you see the digital humanities, and especially this kind of local, reflective, metacritical approach helping us to change the larger ways in which we work in the humanities and in institutions, especially located in the global north?
This is a really good question, because I'm increasingly convinced that, the idea that there is a lone scholar who goes into their hermitage and like emerges with greatness and produces their book is actually a complete misrepresentation of how any of us do scholarship. Even if we are a single author on something, we can look and think about the many ways that there are collaborative practices and processes behind it. Whether it's something as simple as, chatting with your friend about what you're working on, or having your friend read a chapter, or reading and relying on a body of scholarship that comes out of an apparatus of peer review, which is itself a form of collaboration, right? Our scholarship is always in conversation of some kind with other people. And so I think that there is some potential leverage to be gained from actually moving away from that mental model of single scholarship as being what we do in the humanities, and instead, thinking about the fact that no one is actually working alone, even if they think that they're working alone. I mean, as I wrote this book, I wrote this book alone, but I did not write this book alone. And I'm sure that this has been an experience that anyone who has written a book or a dissertation or an article or a book review, there's probably other people involved, right? So I think that there's that. I am a little bit, my main concern about collaboration is really how we're collaborating. In this way, I've been working for the Modern Language Association, with a really wonderful group of colleagues across the US who are writing the guidelines for evaluating public humanities scholarship. And so we want to make sure that there's some way, whether it's for non-tenure track faculty who are being reappointed or getting promoted, or for tenure track faculty, or even for people looking for jobs, so job committees know how to evaluate public humanities scholarship, whether it's digital or not. And so what was really interesting about the conversation is that we almost end up focusing less on, here are the steps for evaluating the scholarship, but instead saying that really the evaluation is of the ethical basis of the project, in things like, how are you collaborating? If you're collaborating with a community, are you being the I am the scholar bringing the light of knowledge to the community kind of person? Or are you the person saying, I recognize that expertise lives in all kinds of places and I am authentically collaborating with community partners? And that means that from the beginning, we are collaboratively identifying what the need and what the problem with the research question is, collaboratively designing what we're going to do about it, ensuring the voices of community stakeholders throughout the process. So, I think it's less about, will the humanities be more collaborative or not? Will this help the humanities? But really, how can the humanities think about situating itself, as collaborators with community members? And even if we think about something like reading, Simone Murray has a really interesting book on digital reading. I don't remember the name of this book. I reviewed it, but it was about reading practices in the digital age. And something that struck me about it, and I think Kathleen Fitzpatrick writes about this in Generous Thinking as well, is that, reading is one way that the humanities sort of makes it out into the world, like collaborative reading practices, people who, write Amazon book reviews, Goodreads, collective reading groups. I mean, these are sort of ways in which we can recognize that public humanities exists. We can recognize that the humanities is not solely located in the university. And I think that's the shift we need to be thinking about. What is our relationship with the world?
Yeah, no, that's great. That's so great. I could comment, but I'm not going to. I'm going to turn it over. Catherine, we have two great questions. One from Catherine Harris. Catherine, do you want to unmute or do you want me to read? Our friend Catherine.
I can unmute. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Roopika, as usual, wonderful. Thank you for presenting this and at lunchtime so that I could eat my lunch while I'm listening to what you have to say. All of it is stuff that you've built tremendously on over the years. And I'm at the point where I'm going, yes, yes, yes. And searching around about how to do these kinds of things. And my question is, what do you suggest that we do in terms of a micro or macro impact? Are we going to professional organizations, or are these changes that we want to make, of course, with ourselves and then become models and spread that around? What do you think is the best way to make impact?
I mean, I think it's like a multi-pronged approach. Some people really feel comfortable with advocacy at, professional organization levels. Some people feel more comfortable with advocacy at their institution. And so I think it is a multi-pronged approach. I do want to briefly speak to the role that the Mellon grant that we've received for the Digital Ethnic Futures Consortium might play in some of this. So my co-PIs on the project are Tanisha Taylor at Texas Southern University, Sonia Donaldson at New Jersey City University, Jamila Moore Pugh at Cal State Fullerton, and my colleague Keja Valens at Salem State University. And what we're trying to do is build a national consortium for practitioners of digital ethnic studies. So, I mean, we're just broadly meaning people who do digital humanities and ethnic studies fields. And so I'm going to actually post a link so Pam's posted a link to our Twitter account. I just solved my problems with Humanities Commons this morning. So I'm posting the link to our Humanities Commons group. We will have a website and everything. We're proofreading it right now. But essentially, to join the consortium, you simply have to join our Humanities Commons group. And the purpose of our work together is really to convene people for networking opportunities. We're going to do a speaker series. We're going to also I have a giant bag of money to give away, because when Mellon came to me and said, what would you do to change the field? Like, if you had a blank check, I said that I have a problem with their model of anointing like one institution and one person with $3 million, but give me $3 million and I would like to make it rain for everybody else. And so that was actually what happened. So what we're doing is some of the money is going to our 3 partner universities to build up their digital humanities infrastructure, to do the kinds of programming that we've done at Salem State, just sort of on a shoestring and bootstrapped and totally unsustainable, to give them money for that, and then also give out grant funds for course development and for curriculum development for people who want to develop sort of coursework, minors, and classes at these intersections of digital humanities and ethnic studies fields, to universities that are R2s. Actually, any university that's not an R1 is probably the best way to put it. So if you're at SDSU, I will make sure that all our information comes to Pam and to Jessica so that you know when our deadlines are and everything like that. Anyone can participate in the consortium, anyone can attend our events, but the money is specifically for universities that have more of an emphasis on teaching. And so this is one way that we're really hoping that we can really build up a next generation of people who are interested in digital humanities, who are thinking about doing it in a wide range of careers, not just through professor jobs, thinking about library careers, thinking about public humanities jobs, thinking about nonprofits, and work that way. So I hope that you will join us in our work and join us for our events. And again, as I said, you can sign up for our Humanities Commons group. That's what membership is. And you're the first people to know that, aside from my co-PIs.
That is so wonderful and so exciting, and also so in the spirit of how we understand things here at State, rather than being, we built our initiative rather than being about a project or a funding opportunity or a single professor, as trying to be about networking and collaboration and people. So this is really exciting. I hope everyone here will take advantage. Let me ask one more question from Samya, who joins us from India. He has two great questions in the chat. And we love having, he's been attending a bunch of our DH talks, so it's really wonderful. And he's also, Roopika, part of the ELO community. Oh, there you are. Hi, do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, sure. It's okay. Yeah, so I have hi for Dr. Risam. Always great listening to you. I just had two quick questions for you. Might not be very quick, but I'll ask them anyway. So the first question is, you were talking about how to decolonize in various processes, but I have a fundamental experiential objection, because in India, people are still wrapping around the heads of what the hell is this thing called DH. It's still in that level of what we call a curiosity, that, oh, really, we can think about literature and technology. It's in that phase right now. I wouldn't even call it, and I'm not mentioning the scholars that you mentioned, like Dr. Dodd, Dr. Ray Murray. I am talking about the regular English departments or the sociology departments or whatever departments in the suburban spaces or the urban spaces. Now, if they are to talk about digital humanities, or they are about to introduce a course in digital humanities, what they will do is they will do a quick Google search to find out who these people are and start reading up on their scholarship. So, and these Google search or algorithmic recommendations will throw up the name of the usual suspects, like you mentioned, the work of Matthew Kirschenbaum, etc., etc. Therefore, finding the local becomes infinitely more difficult than finding the global. So in this case, how do we navigate this problem? Because it is not accessible. The person who might be sitting in the next room and working on digital humanities, we might never know. So how to navigate this problem?
Samya, the same thing happens here. People who don't do digital humanities either think it's distant reading, or they think it's I wrote a blog post. And I always joke, this is why I don't have another job, because there is no way for people to understand scholarship that exists somewhere in between I wrote something and put it on the internet and distant reading, and that there's actually a very rich interdisciplinary, rich multiple methodologies behind the scholarship. And what they do is they try to run a job search, and then they Google and they read like a Wikipedia page about digital humanities, and they think it's Franco Moretti, and that's it, right? Or we need a DH course. We're going to Google what's on there. So I actually think that, we are in that regard, we're very much in a similar situation. But I think it's actually the networking, the connections that we try and build, the outreach we can do. This is why so much of my time has been spent in service. Global Outlook Digital Humanities, I know you from ACH, Samya, and your engagement ACH is part of this too, right? At Alliance of Digital Humanities organizations. SAD, South Asia DH was a thing. Now it's DARTHI, right? So trying to think about the outreach we can do, these networks that we build, the communities that we build to change that. And so that's what I'm trying to do with my colleagues in the Digital Ethnic Futures Consortium, DEFCON for short. But this is, I think, the kind of work. And what's really, really sad is that this is the work that is not rewarded at all in academic reward systems that are looking at what we're publishing. However, I will say that like all of this work that I do becomes the fodder for what I do publish, right? So it's like the experiential work, with professional organizations or on projects that I then think, is there something I can extract from this that is like going to be interesting to other people or help them advance their scholarship? And that's what I end up publishing on. So that's sort of the weird way I get around like the amount of time I spend on service, because I think it's really important, because that's really where we change things.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And your comment about that nobody knows what DH is here it's getting some response from Catherine and myself and others in the chat, because it's still so true. I'm very attentive to time, but I would just like to ask one more question, Roopika, which is about our moment, about hopefully coming out of COVID, and this moment wherein last year Pam and I really felt that hopefully our colleagues in our university would understand the importance of digital humanities more now that we were teaching and learning online, and that this was really an opportunity to show how we could model as a humanity connection and networking and the local, and of refusing certain types of labor, refusing to pretend we're going back to normal, et cetera, at this moment. So I wonder how you are thinking about our moment, our hopefully emerging out of COVID moment, and what that means for digital humanities work.
You know, I've never been fond of the silver linings of COVID discourse that I feel like my institution has been pushing on me since March of 2020, which was actually really around being asked to step in while I was on my sabbatical, not that I'm bitter, and support the faculty's pivot to online teaching, because we didn't have anybody running our Center for Teaching Innovation. We have one wonderful, amazing human being who's in IT, who just knows everything. But she is one person who also has 5 jobs. And so, you know, it was very interesting to be in this experience in which not only was I getting the message that you need to help the faculty, but also you need to help the faculty see that, you know, there is a silver lining, that they can teach online, that we can now offer all these flexible delivery models. And then what happens in August of 2021? Sorry, you can't teach online because we need to teach face-to-face because the pandemic's over, even though the pandemic isn't over, right? And so I have to admit that I am not, I never was convinced that the sort of silver lining and people are going to understand was going to pan out, and I'm still not. What I think that the pandemic has made clear, and I think this is our moment, is that the knowledge that we have in the humanities about technology, about humans' relationships to social media technologies, to computing, to Zoom, I think that we've come away from this experience having a platform to talk about this expertise, to talk about what the humanities can tell us about our contemporary moment. And the challenge is finding ways to make people listen.
Well, I could listen to you all day, and I'm so grateful for your time and generosity, and frankly, all of your service in all of its capacity and brilliance. And I'm also grateful to all of the folks that joined us from all over the place today. Thank you for being here. We appreciate your time and interest. And will you all please join me? You may unmute if you'd like, in thanking Professor Roopika Risam for her time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.